I am A.J. Chaudhry from the Urban Institute, where I am the director of the Center on Labor, Human Services, and Population. The Urban Institute and Chapin Hall are co-sponsors of the Thursday's Child Public Policy Forum. Together, we launched Thursday's Child 2 years ago as a monthly program to engage people from a variety of professional roles in an extended conversation about policies and programs affecting America's children and youth, their families, and their communities. This year, for example, we explored topics ranging from racial disparity in the child welfare system to ways of addressing the needs of children with incarcerated mothers, to the well-being of children of immigrants caught up in deportation raids, and how children and family policy is playing out in this year's presidential campaign. Today's program marks the end of the 2007-2008 Thursday's Child series. In it, we'll discuss school success initiatives that focus on newborns, infants, toddlers, and their parents, and examine how such initiatives emerged when educators, abuse prevention experts, government, and the private sector came together to collaborate at the federal, state, and community level. Our first speaker today will be Deborah Darrow, a research fellow at Chapin Hall and with more than 20 years' experience evaluating child abuse treatment and prevention programs. Prior to coming to Chapin Hall, Deb was director of the National Center on Child Abuse Prevention Research, a program of the National Committee to Prevent Child Abuse. She was president of the American Professional Society on the Abuse of Children and currently serves as the executive council of the International Society for the Prevention of Child Abuse and Neglect. Next will be Ann Kerwin, vice president for national policy consultation at the Ounce of Prevention Fund, where she provides strategic direction and leadership to the Ounce's policy work from outside of Illinois. She also served as the vice president for institutional advancement and assistant director of Kids PEP, the Ounce's policy and advocacy division in Illinois. She is a graduate fellow of 0 to 3, the National Center for Infants, Toddlers, and Families. Following Ann will be Graciela Italiano Thomas, founding CEO and president of Thrive by 5 in Washington, an advocacy organization that champions statewide early learning improvement. She is one of the nation's leading early learning experts and brings more than 3 decades of education and early learning experience to Thrive by 5 Washington. She also served as CEO of Los Angeles Universal Preschool, CEO of Centro de la Familia de Utah, and a senior consultant to the National Head Start Bureau. Our fourth panelist is Shelley Waters Boots, a senior research associate at the Urban Institute. Shelley specializes in children's work and family issues. She was vice president for policy and programs at the nonprofit Parents' Action for Children, acting director for work and family program at the New America Foundation, and director of the Child Care and Development Division at the Children's Defense Fund. Today's moderator is Deborah Williams, associate editor of Catalyst Chicago, an independent news magazine that documents and analyzes school improvement efforts. Deborah joined Catalyst in 1992 while working on her master's degree in journalism. Her beats that she covers include teachers' issues, school leadership, early childhood education, Title I spending, and community involvement. I'll now turn this program over to Deborah to carry us along. Thanks.
Okay. Thank you and good morning. And thank you to the Urban Institute for co-sponsoring this forum with Chapin Hall. I am thrilled to moderate this panel. I've been writing about issues concerning children for the last 15 years, especially those in Chicago public schools. However, it was not until about 5 or 6 years ago that I began to write about issues concerning children under the age of 5. It became clear that topics like school readiness, safety, how to meet the social and emotional needs of young children were very important. They needed to be written about, they needed to be talked about. Then 2 years ago, I became a member of a very special elite club that maybe I can tell a few of you are probably part of this club. It's called the Grandparents Club. And then those issues became even more important. So like all of you, I can't wait to hear from our esteemed panel. And shall we get started? Deb?
Deb, thanks so much. Prevention has long been viewed in this policy realm and the practice realm as the more humane way to go. Wouldn't it be great if we could stop children from experiencing negative outcomes and get a leg up on the social problems that most distress us? And in the field of child abuse, prevention that's the approach we've taken. And in that field, prevention has gone through a variety of stages. Like most attempts to prevent a social problem, we started with awareness about it. In the 1970s, we did a great deal of making the public aware that it shouldn't hurt to be a child, that abuse can happen in all walks of life, and that we needed a public response system as well as a personal response system to address it. We then moved to developing a range of interventions. We didn't see a bad idea out there. There seemed to be a variety of ways to prevent the problem. We developed services for all populations across all age groups. And then in the 1990s, however, we began to focus more specifically on the first few years of life. We shifted a paradigm, if you think of it as being horizontal, where everything was equally efficacious, everything seemed to have merit, to something that was more vertical. And we began to understand that if we wanted to build strong prevention systems, we were going to have to build them the way we raised children, and that was one developmental level at a time. And the most productive place to start was in the first few years of life. This paradigm shift gave us not only opportunities to think more broadly about the interventions we do, but it also got us a little bit out of this silo thinking. We had to ask ourselves, are we just about preventing child abuse? Or are we also really trying to get all children off to a good start? And if we are, aren't we really cutting across a broad array of issues that concern parents and young children? I think multiple factors influenced this shift. Certainly there were evidence-based factors. You know, the brain research, which is now 20 years old, it's not a new idea. We've known for some time that a child's brain starts developing early on, and that the first 3 years of life are important. And I would suggest we knew that before there was any brain research, if you ever had a child. So we can stipulate the first 3 years of life are important, but we had some pretty compelling evidence now that people could see and understand and begin to grasp on what really was happening with the child in those first few years. We also had some compelling evidence that when we invested in children early on through high-quality early education and learning opportunities, whether they were home-based or center-based, we saw remarkable improvements. We put those kids on a trajectory that was far more positive than anything we might have thought we could do. But some of the things that moved us were also political. There began to be in this country a groundswell among politicians that it was good to invest in kids, that that was a particularly useful investment of our public and private service dollars, and that the public itself was interested in supporting these kinds of efforts. And then finally, I think the other factors grew out of a new understanding of the interplay between individual behaviors and context. The public health model really underscores the importance not just of changing behaviors, but creating a context in which it's easier to do the right thing. A context in which individuals understand behaviors they want to do, as well as behaviors they want to see in others do. Think of not smoking. Think of seatbelt loss. Seatbelt use. There is this sense that what we need to do is change our behavior and then help others to also change theirs. It implicitly says that it's not just about targeting services to bad parents, but it's raising the threshold. It's providing some universal base below which we're not willing to let the treatment of any child fall. In the child abuse prevention field, when we were focusing only on ourselves, I would say that we made some gains, and this silo thinking certainly had some benefits early on. We did raise awareness of the problem of child abuse, and we did galvanize the public around taking some action to prevent it. We saw diverse investments at all levels, state and federal levels, specifically in prevention. Now we take the Children's Trust and Prevention Funds in every state in this country for granted. They didn't exist in the 1980s until Ray Helfer had the idea, if we're going to have trust funds for highways, we should have trust funds for children. So we had developed some core funding streams for prevention. We also saw some dramatic improvements in the child welfare system. Not that we've successfully implemented all of our great ideas, but to say the least, we're doing more in the area of family preservation, adoption, alternative response systems, and building community partnerships. And some of the data would suggest, in terms of child abuse reports, the numbers are actually encouraging. David Finkelhor would say, reports, substantiated cases are down. Child neglect has dropped a little bit, but reports involving physical abuse are down 48% over what they were in 1990. Sexual abuse reports are down 53%. So all in all, we did get some gains by focusing just on our problems. But there's some drawbacks to this silo thinking, and that's what I want to sort of lead our discussion into for today. The vast majority of prevention efforts we did address focused still on changing individuals. It was still about fixing those bad parents, those parents that couldn't quite get it, couldn't quite care for their children, and that if we could fix the bad parents, all would be well. It also created a system that I think is very good for what I call consumer families, families that understand that they have a problem, know they need something, and are able to go out, figure out how to manage the system and access their services. We continued to do very little for the families that I call dependent or broken families, those families that may not know they have a problem, or if they do know, they're clueless about how to manage a social service program system to get the help they need. I think we also paid very limited attention to quality. We focused more on breadth than depth. We wanted something everywhere, and we didn't give much thought to whether it was being done well. And I think most importantly, the old system did nothing to challenge this notion that good parents can handle things on their own. It did nothing to challenge all of us to say, what's our responsibility for supporting newborns and their parents? I think we've moved to a new day. We've moved away from models that fix broken parents to a situation where we're talking about crafting systems and integrated response systems that can help parents do the right thing. We want to create the context where it's easier for programs parents to do the right thing, and it's easier for good programs to thrive. This emphasis is really a shift from a unique focus on specific isolated problems to thinking about the role of specific service models and how they can be used to leverage change in those areas we most need to see change in. On this point, I think it's helpful to think about Ron Heifetz's consideration about, in his book Leadership Without Easy Answers, about the difference between technical solutions and adaptive challenges. We have a lot of technical solutions we still need to put in place in this country, whether it's home-based early learning, whether it's high-quality childcare, whether it's universal access to health care, whether it's providing universal pre-K to all four-year-olds. And we need to do those with an attention both to reaching deeper into those populations we know we need to get into, but asking ourselves questions about the populations we're still leaving behind. Many prevention programs talk about working with the highest risk. The truth is, we're nowhere near engaging the highest risk families. We don't have models that work effectively for families who are dealing with substance abuse issues. I'm not talking about addicts, but families in which substance abuse is just sort of a lifestyle. It's a way of life. They take it or they don't take it, but it's a dominant way in which they're governing how resources are being spent and how they're spending their time and their choices. We don't know much about how to reach those families. We don't know much about how to reach families that are suffering from domestic violence, families that are really resistant to having someone coming in and being involved in their daily lives, families that are really struggling with mental health issues, individuals who are so socially isolated. Whether you live in rural communities, you can be socially isolated living down in the highest concentrated area in the city of Chicago. We don't have good resources for reaching out to those people. And to do that, I think we do need to begin to think about systems that will allow us to do that differently. So in addition to looking at services, I think in and of themselves, I think we also need to say, how can we use these services to advance our thinking, to really begin to get some kind of changes, almost have a transformation in how the normative standards are set and how institutions work together. Changes in this idea of mutual reciprocity. I've done many household surveys now, and people are twice as likely to tell me that they've given help as they say that they've asked for help. And that's the problem. We're still a country that we do want to give. We're generous people. We do want to be involved with others. But in order for this exchange to work, each one of us has to be willing to say, I can't do it myself. I am vulnerable, to put ourselves in really a learning mode. And I might say that learning mode is not important just for families, but it's also true for professionals in the field. So many of us think we've hit the top of the mountain, we have all the answers, we're the experts, we're the people in charge, we're the ones with the long history. Well, you know, if we were so brilliant in our efforts, we would have solved the problem by now. So I suspect that those of us that are at the top of the mountain need to spend a lot more time looking for those that are coming along and see what new ideas are emerging and move from the sort of sole leadership role to really being a mentor, to being a supporter. And then finally, I think what we need to see in addition to developing mutual reciprocity and improving collaboration, is really building a public will. I think we talk about wanting to invest in children, but we're clueless about how much we're really willing to invest in children. This is not a cheap endeavor. One more person tells me an ounce of prevention is worth a pound to cure, as if prevention was cheap. We could do it on the side with just some residual money that's left over. To really have a prevention focus politically and in a service venue is really about altering where your priorities are. And if we really want to get children off to a good start, we have to be committed to making the investment to see that that can happen. Thanks.
Wonderful. Okay. Next, we'll hear from Ann, who will speak about what's happening at the state level.
Great. Well, thank you. It's always a pleasure to hear from Deb, who I think has certainly challenged me personally, and I think probably many of us to continue to think comprehensively and systemically about all that we need to be doing for vulnerable children and families in the earliest years. My job is to bring this down to a state level and get a little bit more specific. It was terrific to hear Deb's ideas about how things have developed over time. I think you'll find some similarity in the Illinois story and a lot of things that resonate with what we've gone through and what Deb put out there for us. For those of you who aren't familiar with the Ounce Prevention Fund, I really wanted to quickly tell you that we're an organization that's in our 26th year. We sit in the middle of running programs, advocating for public policies for young children, training practitioners, in particular home visitors around the state of Illinois, doing research, and increasingly partnering with other communities that are developing educare centers and policy change for children birth to 5. Program remains at the heart of what we do at the Ounce Prevention Fund, and it drives all of our policy and other work. And while we focus exclusively on children birth to 5, you can see that we take sort of a broad cut at that. I want to be very clear that while I'm here from the Ounce Prevention Fund, what I'm going to talk about in Illinois is really representing the work of a variety of players and organizations all across the state: advocacy organizations, foundations, research organizations, public and government agencies. So I just want to be very clear that what we've been able to accomplish here in Illinois and what we need to continue to deal with the challenges ahead of us is that collective and broad participation. So really quickly, I want to share what Illinois' experience has been in bringing all of these players together to work on building a comprehensive early childhood system. I also want to give you a glimpse of some of the system and policy changes that have come out of taking a systems approach and the collaborative work. And then finally, I want to touch on a couple of factors that I think have been essential to the progress we've been able to make in Illinois. So first, just a little bit of Illinois context. When I say the early childhood system, I'm thinking as broadly as you can possibly think. This is every program and every government program or system that touches the lives of young children and their families. So this is everything from education and care to health, mental health, early intervention, child welfare, family support, so the broadest swath. And you should also know that Illinois does have a pretty robust public investment portfolio for young children at this point in time. And those investments, again, cut across all of those areas. And for those of you who track the advocacy work and the progress that's been made in recent years in the state capitol, you'll know that people have come together to continue to push for a broad and collective agenda. I do think that one of the things that's been helpful is that the public and the private partners in Illinois have really taken a long-term view and acknowledged that we do have to build this step by step and do this in a developmental way. And I'll talk about the developmental trajectory in a moment. I also think that it's important to know we have a couple of touchstones in Illinois that I think, again, everybody has bought into broadly over time that make it easier to work together and advance some changes. And one is a birth to 5 approach and commitment that dates back several decades, a commitment to serving at-risk children first, but not exclusively, building on what we have and not continuing to create new programs and initiatives, but to think about how we make what we have better and how we connect those efforts. And then obviously very closely aligned with that is building a system and not just growing programs. And then a broad look at all domains of children's development, and as Deb mentioned, quality, which is something that we've focused on in the past but continues to be sort of a pressing need and trend for us for the future. So if we think about Illinois' sort of developmental trajectory, if you will, over the past 2.5 decades, I want to talk about 3 phases that I think we've gone through. One is, I've got a different vertical and horizontal than Deb, but my vertical is the first phase, so that's the growth of programs. As Deb mentioned, there was a context in which Illinois sat nationally that led to public investments in early childhood beginning in the 1980s. And so we were growing up programs and making investments in a variety of things. We had the beginning of intensive home visiting programs with Parents Too Soon in the early 80s, capped out the decade with significant investment in Healthy Families America. In Illinois, our state pre-K program At Risk began in the 1980s. Towards the end of that decade, the State Board of Education, which is sort of a novel thing and has helped us get to where we are now, began to invest in infants and toddlers as well as preschoolers. And we also had the Early Head Start program federally come into Illinois in the early 90s, as well as the state children's health insurance program. So again, a huge infusion of resources and focus, but we really felt that things were starting to be a little bit too siloed, and we needed to turn our work to the systems effort. So if we kind of came to a fork in the road, I would say about 1998, and realized that we could continue to work vertically, or we could continue to put the horizontal pieces in place to really build a system, if you can sort of visualize Stonehenge working on the horizontal lentils. We did do this proactively, though. The Allerton Prevention Fund and some other public and private partners pulled together something called the Birth to 3 Project. At that point in particular, birth to 3 issues had not had much attention, and we really wanted to get a sense of what was going on in the state and what some of the gaps were. So we pulled together a broad group of folks to begin to talk, and we intentionally set a large table to answer questions such as, what public investments are we making? Where are the gaps? Where might there be overlap or duplication? How should the programs relate to each other? And what kind of workforce do we need? And coming out of this, there were a couple of important things that continue to push the systems development work forward. One was a focus on early childhood mental health as a huge gap. The second was on coordinating prevention programs that are funded by a variety of agencies, both at the state level and at the community level. And an effort to connect the health sector to the early childhood sector more effectively. In this sort of second phase of systems coordination, I also want to mention a couple of other tables that have been very important in terms of a cross-disciplinary approach and a public-private approach to problem solving and systems change. One is the Early Learning Council. That was a piece of legislation passed by the state legislature and is co-chaired by the governor's office and the private sector. And so that has primarily been around developing the Preschool for All effort and infusing new education dollars into a broad range of birth to 5 programs. We also have a children's mental health partnership that has been focusing on children's mental health needs birth to 18 with some very specific and targeted work to the early childhood mental piece as well. But in addition to tables, I think we also began to think more creatively in this time period about funding streams and financing mechanisms that might be able to reach across and begin to benefit more than one program. So the Early Childhood Block Grant was something that was created in this time period to bring together several funding streams within the State Board of Education. Over time, we've opened that up so that child care centers, home visiting programs, school districts, and a whole variety of other community-based programs can apply for that funding. So I think it's important to think sometimes about the financing mechanisms we can put in place that transcend some of the silos. So where do I think we are now? I think we're in the early years of what I would call sort of the scaling up phase. We built our vertical investments. We began to come together to say, how does this stuff relate? And now we know that there is a great need that's still unaddressed for vulnerable children and families in the early years around the state of Illinois. So how do we bump up and take this to scale around the state? And clearly to do that well, we're turning our time not just to raising resources and growth issues, but really to building the infrastructure. And the series of questions that I think are on the table now is, very serious challenges around workforce. How do we expand and train the existing workforce to keep pace with the growth in programs? How do we continue to make strides on quality to infuse the research and evaluation findings into program design and into policy development? How do we address limited space capacity issues, which is a huge problem in communities all around the state for center-based care? How do we start to get to some of the hard-to-reach populations now that we're going to expand our efforts across the state? So culturally and linguistically diverse communities, the homeless population, special needs populations, the child welfare populations. We also need to really pay a lot of attention to ensure that programs have the resources and funding to implement the quality program as designed. And I think we really need to think carefully about what is required in terms of sort of all of the supports to a program to deliver a quality model. And then finally, putting evaluation and monitoring pieces in place as another piece of the quality assurance thing. So the Early Learning Council in Illinois has sort of evolved into its second phase from developing a plan for new funding and expansion of the system in Illinois to really looking at these implementation and infrastructure issues. The other challenge that I would sort of put out that I think all of us are dealing with now in this phase 2 is that we've made, because of the growing visibility and traction that early childhood has had, we've made room at the table for new partners, in particular from the private sector. And I think while they bring significant support and an important voice for our work, they also bring different expectations about quality outcomes and the kinds of returns they're looking for. So it's continued to sort of keep the heat on in terms of the quality efforts. Really quickly, I want to give you a couple of concrete examples. You might say, to what end do we do this systems work, and to what end do we sit together? I wanted to just share with you a couple of policy and systems changes. Some of them are things that have developed within a particular funding stream to make that stronger and more systemic, and some of them have benefited multiple programs and agencies. And I want to be very clear here, too, that significant state agency leadership has been critical in a lot of these changes. And so some senior level folks in the various departments and divisions across the state of Illinois who run programs for young children have great latitude to make some funding and policy decisions sort of on the ground, and that they've showed significant leadership over time in helping to build and improve our systems. Quickly on mental health, we have mental health consultation available in almost all of the early childhood programs that I talked about throughout the prevention system, from preschool to childcare to home visiting to Part C. We've also had significant reforms within public health and Medicaid to better address mental health needs. Obviously, this has a very close tie to workforce, and the Erickson Institute is partnering with a number of state agencies now to really train mental health consultants, again, to meet the demand as we scale up the programs. On the treatment end, which is another one of these sort of more challenging things that I think you get to a little bit later in the game, we have to make sure that there are actually adequate mental health treatment options for young children out there once prevention programs are able to screen and refer, as they're doing more systematically right now. And so pregnant women and young children are finally a priority population within the Department of Mental Health. And there are serious workforce efforts as well for mental health professionals who need to be trained not just in mental health, but also in working with young children. On a broader sort of birth to 3 workforce issue, an infant toddler credential that's been in development for a number of years is now being piloted at 12 higher ed institutions. And the Preschool for All investment that's come in the last few years under the current administration dedicates 20% of the funding to infrastructure efforts, so everything from the mental health consultants to evaluation, monitoring, and workforce. So I think that's an important example, again, of needing to not just put the money into programs, but really into the infrastructure and the system. And let me just close by touching on a couple of things that I think have been key to this success. One has been the broad membership and participation. There have been nearly 400 individuals involved in a variety of the systems tables, and I think over 200 folks in some aspect of the Early Learning Council over time. We've been able to leverage the government expertise at the table and the senior leadership's ability to make some changes. We've built new relationships, both public to public and public to private, and I think been able to really have some reciprocal relationships going on where there's learning and expertise going back and forth in that exchange, rather than what might typically be an adversarial relationship between advocacy organizations and government. Philanthropic support clearly has helped to move forward the advocacy and support systems development. And I think one of the first things that happened when a number of us came together to talk about some of the birth to 3 systems issues was to go to the community, as Deb said, and not forget what was going on there. And so I think we need to continue to think about what parents and the folks in the field are telling us. They were the ones who said you need to focus on early childhood mental health in a serious way right now, and that has led us to do that work. So I think our work is cut out for us as we all move forward here in Illinois, and I'm anxious to hear from other folks about how they're approaching that in Washington State and as well at the federal level. So thank you.
Garcia. Okay, now we'll hear from Graciela, who will talk about a local initiative in Washington State.
Thank you, Anne and Deb. And yeah, I have the privilege to be on the ground attempting to actually live this adaptive challenge and integrated thinking that my colleagues have talked about. And it is quite challenging, but it's also very exciting. And that's why I'm in the state of Washington. I was asked to share my story. I started my career, I started my life in South America and ended up being an elementary school teacher after a short stint teaching languages in high school and understanding that that wasn't the right age to be teaching languages, foreign languages to children. So I went down from high school to elementary, became an elementary school a teacher, taught kinder through 5th grade for several years, was a principal, and then came to Head Start and early learning. And the last 12, 15 years have been in early learning. And it's been really a trajectory of understanding that they are too old, even when they are 5, to receive some of the work that we with such good intentions, we want to do and provide and do together with these families. So what has happened to me in my work in early learning is that I have really gone back and refound the humility to learn, to learn from the families, to learn from the communities. And in Washington State, what attracted me was the fact that you had all those elements that Anne was talking about. You have philanthropists, you have business, you have the state, you have the elected officials representing policy, all coming together in this public-private partnership called Thrive by 5 Washington. And really, it had been in the works for 2 years before they even started searching for a CEO. So they were getting down to doing some of the early work. And the work was really about convening the attention to the issue, asking the right questions, and moving towards, without doubt now, creating a movement in the state of Washington, understanding that the state of Washington needed to pay attention to what was happening to children before 5. What indicator, 5 years of age, what indicators we use depends on the audiences we're talking about. But the indicator that seems to really resonate with all of these stakeholders that are coming together to convene attention is the fact that when children come to kindergarten, according to kindergarten teacher observations, more than 50% of them in the state of Washington are not ready to succeed in school. They don't have what they need to make an easy transition. And that, obviously, those of us who've been working in early learning can go back to the moment a family gets pregnant and what happens to that family and what happens to that child being born and what happens afterwards. But the interesting thing that is happening in Washington is in this convening into this public-private partnership and bringing substantial resources of private dollars, understanding that, yes, this cannot be scaled up with private dollars, but there will always be a role for private dollars in this effort, because we're really talking about, as a society, embracing children with policy. And we've heard what has, the brief stories of what have happened in Illinois, and we know of other places, other states where this has been happening in, over a period of time, and because relationships were there and leadership was there. But now we have a state who has looked at it and said, we are behind and we need to do something about it, and here's what we're going to do. So in funding and founding the private-public partnership, they convened attention, and the state responded with creating the Department of Early Learning, a state agency that reports to the governor, where at this moment, all those that were licensing child care centers across the state and were kind of lost in the 30,000 people bureaucracy of the state are coming together. Now, we don't have the integration yet that you and I would like to see all of the programs that relate and serve families with children birth to 5 in that department, but it's a beginning. And the important part of the role that Thrive by 5 plays, and that I have just the privilege of learning from, is that we are kind of the catalysts. We are sort of patterned after the ounce, but it's kind of like the next generation. Let's see how we can do this in a way simultaneously without going to scale. But we have 2 very clear partners, local partners, Thrive communities, one on the east side of the state and one on the west side of the state. And Washington is not unique in its, what I call, terminal uniqueness. You have to prove that it works here in these local places. Even though we have evidence that these programs have worked elsewhere, we have to show to elected officials and opinion leaders that it works here. So we've been working with these 2 communities now for 2 years, over 2 years, in really developing what would work for them. And the idea was to create a sort of a template, begin with what was there, but not create new programs and do more initiatives, but look at what was there and try to be creative, innovative in connecting the pieces at the local level in a way that made sense to families, and that really kept the funding and all of the things that have to happen for that easy, simple delivery service behind the scenes of the family, of those who are receiving the services. It's been challenging. It's been fascinating. The communities both are very diverse. One is on the south side of King County, just a half hour from downtown Seattle. The other one is on the east side of the state. It's a more rural community. But we have ended up with a template that includes, in both cases, home visiting, which we call home-based early learning. And this goes again to the fact that if we're starting with the fact that we want to create social change because children, the gap is already there when children come to school at age 5. And so we are looking at what happens in this first 5 years, that gap that is already there. We know that if children are a year or more behind, it's very hard for them to catch up through their school career. And you know all of the indicators of vocabulary and all of that. And so how do we come to this place of being with families who have young children and work with them to have interventions from the moment the family gets pregnant, and in some cases it's home visitation, which again we call home-based early learning. That's what I was trying to tell you, because the thread is learning. It's not that we're not holistic and developmental, but you have when you try to create this kind of change, even though you're starting with local partners, there is part of the strategy which is a statewide strategy. Hopefully you're going to end up there by creating not only good programs and good infrastructure, but information that will inform those who have the power to make policy and to allocate funds. So you need to just kind of keep that thread of early learning. And it took me a while to understand why we didn't have home visiting, in the Department of Early Learning, for example, until I learned that home visiting has this traditional assumption of being a social service program. And those who were looking at this from an early learning perspective were concerned about home visiting. And so it was just a simple conversation across the table and said, how about if we call it home-based early learning? And it worked. So we call it home-based early learning. And obviously, because the nature of our work is to be innovative and look at how we can improve it, because of that issue that Anne was bringing up, the stakes are higher when you have, like at Thrive, $40 million of private dollars. And that are looking for what is happening, what are the results, sometimes too early, but how are we implementing, what is everyone saying? We have an evaluation coming right behind. So we included home-based early learning in both communities in different programs, understanding that families need different levels of intensity and different ways of entering the system. So navigating the system, creating a system that is easy to navigate and that is constantly improving. This is, for me, the constant. And the one guiding principle that I think as we move into this adaptive change, if we kept in mind, I know that we can make real difference in families, even those who are homeless and those who are, like Deb was talking about. It's continuous quality improvement. And I do mean continuous quality improvement in the sense that we go for excellence. We know where we are, we're very grounded in our reality, but we never stop moving and challenging ourselves and assessing and feeding back into the system and making ourselves accountable. That is one thing that I found as I moved into the field of early learning, this resistance to accountability. It doesn't mean we have to test children when they are 4 with direct assessment, but we have to behave as adults if we are going to really make a difference in the life of these very, sometimes marginalized families and children. So what we are doing in the communities is a variety of home-based early learning programs. We're using nurse-family partnership. We're using parents as teachers. We're using, help me out, Deb, here. We're using, well, first of all, let me just say before I go to programs that we worked very hard to create common outcomes and indicators, and that's where Deb Darrow was called in to help us, because when you give community dollars to plan and you have such diverse communities, they are used to how we've been doing things. And so they say, well, if you have this much money, we want more of this and more of that and more of the other. We want more programs here, we want a coordinator there. And this innovative thinking just doesn't happen because you say, here's money and be creative. And so as I came in and looked at it, I said, oh, we need somebody to help elevate the dialogue in every one of these pieces that we're doing. And we called on Deb to be that person to help our local partners figure out how we're going to do this differently. And so, very much in line with her work, she said, well, let's begin with the outcomes. Can we have common indicators before we start talking about programs? And so let's go backwards and see what we need first, where we want to land, what activities we each have, what curriculums, how do we, and then what training we're going to need, and then we go to the programs. And so we've used that as a template for every one of our services. Other things that we're doing with the communities is quality improvement system for licensed childcare, whether it's family childcare or center childcare. And again, quality improvement does not mean that you decrete that you're going to improve quality. You've got to create a system of attraction. You have to create incentives. You have to have more resources, both monetary and stronger platforms. You have to have coaching and mentoring, which is consultative and not expert-like, coming in and telling people what to do. The field of early learning is somewhere in between a cottage industry and a professional field. We've got, the average worker, as I recall in LA when I was doing my work at LA Up, is 46 years of age. We can't come into these homes of these middle-aged women who in most cases speak other languages and have been learning English and tell them this and that. We as the experts, I think, have to begin adapting to how do we do this differently if we really want sustainable change and not change that is decreted and short-lasting. And I think if we look back in our history, and others do this a lot better than I, we can see how every time we've decreed change and we have not allowed the process and supported the process, it is short-lived. So what are we doing? What else are we doing? I think my time is pretty much up. The exciting part is that we're learning, and that we are all learning that we have to learn. The communities, the philanthropists, the business people, the corporate leaders, the policy makers, the elected officials, and us, the so-called experts in the field, are coming together. And for me, from the work I have done, it's very exciting that we're listening to families. And we're listening to what makes sense to them, because I think often in our zeal to fund and address policy and influence everything in the system, we get way too distant. And the last piece I want to talk about, because it's really not yet in our focus, but it's impossible to do this if we don't have a coherent way of developing this workforce. And then again, there you get into resources. In LA County, we were talking about, salary parity with K through 12. In the state of Washington, we can't even say that out loud, or we'll be booted out of the room. So we in this country are everywhere as far as how do we value our children, and how do we value those who take care of them? I'm going to leave it at that.
Right. Now we'll hear from Shelley, who will talk about these issues on a federal level.
Oh, great, and good morning. It's a delight to be on this panel, and I'm feeling so optimistic after hearing this. I hope I'm not throwing a big bucket of cold water when I bring you the perspective from Washington, D.C. All I can say is that I would love to import some of this great thinking into Washington. And in an era of campaigns, I should be explicit. Is that an official endorsement of Deb and Ann and Graciela? Yes, I will officially endorse them to bring their early childhood leadership to Washington, D.C. First, I just want to make a couple of observations and provide, I think, a context for where I see the federal government fitting into some of this conversation. And first point I want to make, just explicitly is this idea of school readiness really being a key framework issue for one of the policy goals that we have for all children, regardless of which system they're touching. It seems that what we're really trying to do today is to weave together a conversation that talks about, first of all, a very broad definition of what we mean by school readiness, and that, as Deb said, and I think this is an important point to reiterate, a community or sort of collective response to what that means for kids and families, not an individual response. And so what I think we've suffered from a bit is this sort of elephant in the room problem, which is that each of us are touching a different part. We work on the part we're touching, we define it by the part that we're touching, and what we're really trying to do is figure out how can we come to some collective vision about what school readiness means for children and their families, and then how do we actually start to identify where the gaps are and what we work on. At the federal level, there are at least 3 policy levers that the federal government can pull when they're looking at addressing these issues of school readiness for children. I'm going to touch on 3 of them: the child care subsidy system, the child welfare system, and then Head Start and Early Head Start. And the child care subsidy system, as you can imagine, has a host of challenges, as we've heard from some of our panelists, on really integrating the child developmental needs into the system. That seems a bit ironic, given that it's really our main federal funding support for the care of young children in this country, but really as a designed work support, we have a long way to go to build in the child developmental needs into this program. The 4% set aside, while admirable, is really taking us nowhere near where we need to be in talking about the quality of the experiences of children in that program. Child welfare is another area that has federal funding and some federal leadership, and there's a move actually towards focusing on some of the early childhood issues. A recent report actually just released last month showed that about 55% of infants and toddlers with substantiated cases of abuse and neglect have at least 5 risk factors for poor developmental outcomes. So we know that we have a big task ahead of us in thinking about the children who are in touch with the child welfare system. But we have this perpetual funding problem that Deb alluded to, which is that 90% of the federal child welfare funding goes to out-of-home placement and only 10% goes to prevention and post-permanency. We have to figure out a way to turn that on its head if we're going to get serious about truly doing this horizontal integration that we're talking about. And before I move to Head Start, I think it's worth noting that these 2 particular federal policy levers are highly devolved. There are limits to the extent that the federal government can really make a lot of movement in these 2 areas, because these 2 policy areas really sit with much more autonomy at the state and local level. After hearing this presentation, that might not be a bad thing, but there's still a role for federal government here, and I'll get back to that in a minute. Finally, there's Early Head Start and Head Start, which is a uniquely federal program and has some of the best data and research about how you would actually try to operationalize this integration between the needs of at-risk children, the comprehensive services, and the supports that young children birth to 5 need. And the news has been, from the research community, has been positive on this. The downside is that we've never really fully funded the program to meet anywhere near the current definition of those who are eligible. And as I and others might argue, that we also should be thinking about a much broader array of services for children further up the income scale, because we know that there are needs there too. I think that as states and communities, as Graciela and Anne have talked about, continue to do some of their work, there's a real philosophical question in Washington that's coming around how Head Start evolves to continue to meet the needs of children and families and build off of the work that's happening in states and communities. There's sort of 2 mindsets, I think, in Washington around this. There's a group of advocates and thinkers around Head Start that think, as state pre-K programs come online, that Head Start evolves into serving more of the birth to 3 population. There are others, however, in the advocacy community that think, no, we need to maintain a 0 to 5 or birth to 5 agenda, but really make it more about comprehensive services and fill in the gaps around comprehensive services that aren't necessarily being met by some of the designed state pre-K programs. I think that's a key philosophical challenge that the early childhood community is going to have to work out as things move forward. But a larger challenge, and this you kind of get when you end up talking more to policymakers and their staffs, is how do you actually think about federal policy given filling in gaps, given that the gaps are so different state to state, community to community. You've heard two examples here of some of the leaders in this country who've been able to weave together programs and supports for families. But I can assure you that if you go to other parts of our country, you won't hear any stories at all like this. So if you think about a federal program filling in gaps, knowing that the gaps are different everywhere, it's very hard for federal policymakers to think about how you scaffold federal policy off of these situations, given that what is pre-K in New Jersey is different than what is pre-K in Illinois, and what is home visiting in Seattle looks very different than what home visiting is in St. Louis. I'll add here, not really some systems issues, but a couple of other pieces that I think are completely divorced from these three large system pieces. And I want to put these on the table because I think it's important, again, when we're talking about integrating our thinking, that these are other parts of the puzzle to be putting in. We know from the research that there's a key importance around parental time and bonding and family experiences to children's overall development. So I want to make sure that we also put on the table in this conversation the issues of paid parental leave, which I think are critical to children's early development, and especially the maternal attachment and sensitivity issues that have been linked to positive child outcomes. And as Graciela talked about a little bit, the home visiting issues, which again have a strong research component and an important piece, I think, of parenting support that we often silo, again, out of a common theme I think you've heard from all of us, but silo out of these larger systems conversations. And then the other depressing fact, to just put it on the table, but I think it's a reality that we as adults, as Graciela said, have to deal with, is that it's an incredibly tight fiscal environment in Washington. My colleagues have been doing work at the Urban Institute on the share of the federal budget that goes to children. And if you really want something to depress you, read that report. And frankly, not only is it small, the spending on children overall, and I'm not just talking about these services, but spending on children over the entire federal budget, but it's also, if you take out the growth in children's portion of Medicaid, you take out the one piece that goes to kids from entitlement spending, the share is really on spending on children is set to decline over the coming years. So that's a real hurdle that we have to get serious about. We have to face it and then figure out how we integrate that into our work, that while we're both growing vertically and growing horizontally, we've got these pie issues over here that we have to deal with if we really want to make sure we're able to do our work, and how we grow the pie for children and families. So, after that depressing thought, do I still see a role for federal government, and if so, what does that look like? Yes, and there's a couple of, I think, three things I want to highlight for the federal government that I think we could be doing. First is just an issue of leadership and thinking more broadly about school readiness or school readiness agenda. How does that play out, though, given this fiscal environment? And unlike the Illinois example, we actually have people in Washington, D.C. that want to take credit for new programs as opposed to fund existing ones. That means that we can probably bet that it's more of a piecemeal approach that we'll have from the federal level. And as I thought about this, it's definitely not ideal, but it's not entirely bad either. I think it's, as we do in this field so well, end up trying to figure out how to make lemonade out of lemons. So what you can think about as you see little pieces of policy or money for example, the Pre-K Act, or a little bit of money here and there for home visiting, is to think about how we seed these programs and these conversations as a way to build federal support, build federal champions and policymaker champions on these issues, and as you get the programs, then work to start to grow them. And I think there again, with the pre-K bill and the Education Begins at Home Act, there's some signs that federal policymakers are wanting to do something in this area. And I should also just note that as I was getting on the plane last night from Washington, I heard that they did schedule a hearing on the Education Begins at Home Act for next week. So please put that on all of your radars, because I think this is an important conversation to be having at the federal level at this time. The second thing, and probably even more importantly, is that the federal government can start to do the real work of identifying barriers to connecting within these existing systems and work to remove those barriers. Part of that is ensuring that these funding streams that have been created don't actually tie the hands of the people who are working with kids and families. That seems rather straightforward, but you'd be amazed at what a novel idea that is in Washington. We also can start rethinking our current systems, the rules, the roles, and the relationships with other systems, and some of that work can and should be done at the federal level. So for example, my colleagues Gina Adams and Monica Rohacek have a great paper out on the child care subsidy system and talking about how you actually infuse child development needs into the system and what that means for changing those rules and roles and relationships within that system. I think in child welfare, there's a lot of frontline workers who actually are very aware and want to be doing more issues around early childhood development with the families that they touch, but need more tools and supports to make that happen. And I think some of the positive movements that we've seen in the court systems about making sure that judges in the child welfare system actually understand the child development implications for some of the decisions that they make are all positive. So I think that there's room to grow here, and the federal government can actually start looking at these barriers between these silos and identifying ways to, from the federal level, remove some of the barriers. And finally, as we overcome this fiscal crisis, for kids and families, I think the federal government can provide resources for the not-so-sexy work of building systems and bringing them together. I'm about to release a paper with my colleague Jennifer McCumber and Anna Danziger about a host of child developmental policies that could be put in place across systems, one of which is an idea that we've come up with called the Comprehensive Early Childhood Bridge Fund, which would provide states with resources to bridge the child care and Head Start, early Head Start gaps to help meet the needs of children, and particularly children in working families. So I think getting creative about infusing dollars and then letting states do that work. I think Illinois and Washington both have been able to glue these systems together using private dollars, but in other communities where the private dollars aren't available, can the federal government really take a role in helping pull those programs together? And in child welfare, I think really trying to move seriously to investing in comprehensive family-based treatment, which really would allow child welfare workers the funding, the resources, and the supports to connect families and systems to the systems of support in their community. And then one final point that I'd like to make, and I think as Deb alluded to this a bit, is that we actually have a broad challenge collectively, I think federal, state, and local level, as we're continuing to think about how we bring these pieces together. And the first is that whether you sit in an advocacy organization or a foundation, or at the policymaking table, this theme of silos and how we actually overcome these silos is really critical. And then secondly, after we've overcome that issue, how do we sell it to the public? And I'm dividing it out on purpose because I think sometimes we think about how to sell it to the public without having done the hard work of integrating among ourselves the thinking, the vision, the connecting the dots. And I think we actually have to think about this as two separate steps, mostly because, then this won't come as a shock to any of you, but the federal government does not do comprehensive well. Holistic is not a word you see in any of the committee titles. It's just not the way policy is made. So federal policymakers aren't going to do this until we collectively as a field have sat down as researchers and funders and advocates and practitioners and really worked to break down the silos, or at a minimum, and we understand that silos are in some way the reality that all of us are facing, to make these walls much more permeable so that, and closely connected, and that we are the ones connecting the dots for families, not making families connect across the silos. And until we do that collectively, I think it's hard to then give our policymakers a vision for what A, it should look like, and B, where the gaps are. I think that's really important. Then after we've done that, you might end up selling the solution either to the public or to policymakers in parts and pieces, and that's just the reality of the way policy is done. But I do think that this integrating our own thinking, talking across systems in ways that are new and different, as we've seen, are actually possible, which I think is the great news from this panel, I think until we've done that, it's going to be very hard to truly figure out, A, what it is we're trying to build, what role the federal government has in that, and how we actually ensure that we're developing the supports and services that help prepare children for school and later success. I'll stop there.
Okay, now we are moving to a question and answer portion of the panel. If you could, there are 2 microphones here. You could come up, state your name, who you're with, and please ask a brief question and no opinions. While you're thinking about that, I have a couple that I'd like to ask myself, and this one is directed at Deb. What can agencies do to help families access services who don't know that they need them?
You know, one strategy that's been used in a number of communities is to really put in place some sort of universal initial assessment at the time someone has a baby. And this isn't the time where you go in and you list find all the complaints people have, but whether you're talking about doing this in Cuyahoga County, I know they're going to be doing it in Seattle, and Yakima Thrive by 5 sites. They're doing it in Durham County now. It's sitting down and having a conversation with everyone who's giving birth about what their expectations are with their child, what challenges they think they're going to face, and then linking them up. The way they describe this in Durham is the handing the baton. Nobody drops the baton. So it's not that this initial visit is about solving every problem, but it's getting a comprehensive handle and assessment on what exactly it is that new parents need, regardless of what background they're coming from. And then to be able to offer families or channel them to those services that are most appropriate. The logic behind this is, one, we need a lot more information about what new parents need. We really don't have a threshold. If you were producing a product, you'd go out and do some kind of market survey. We haven't done our market surveys very well. But also important in this concept is you're building demand for the services. Part of it is saying, okay, this is exactly what we need to have, and then you're challenging public institutions to come and provide the resources they need to do it. That at the moment right now, there's a lot of general talk about, I think we need X level of services for families, but we kind of are clueless about what families need. And I think this idea of an initial outreach, because I think that if everybody was asked the question, it wouldn't seem to be particularly onerous, it wouldn't seem to be intrusive to parents. They do this in many Western developed countries. This is not some kind of bogus idea that only that people do it to take charge of the lives of children. It's a much more thoughtful way of how you assess what families need, providing some threshold of support for everybody, and more importantly, really building your service response system in a more rational way.
Okay. Next question is for Ann. There are a lot of things that are happening in Illinois that further along than a lot of states, but it seems like there's still a lot of infrastructure pieces that are out there. Let's talk about one. What is the state doing to increase the quality of certified Type 04 teachers for early childhood ed?
I believe this is not my area of expertise, but I believe that through the Preschool for All efforts, there are some new attempts to certify some cohorts of teachers, help folks who've got BAs begin to get that certification and move that along a lot more quickly to help keep up with the demand.
Fabulous. Okay, are there any questions? Please, if you could come up to the mic and speak into the mic, please.
Well, then it has to be
Is it open? Is it on?
Good morning.
Well, maybe we're down to one mic. Let's see.
Good morning. Okay. My name is Jane Hoffman. I'm with the Illinois College Access Network. And the question that I have is, I'm thinking it's more of the elephant in the room that I'm making light of, and I'd like to hear from Deborah Darby and Graciela Thomas, if possible, on how would you propose, what kind of ideas do you have for linking federal and state together on public health for for birth to 3-year-old children. I think getting some of those ideas maybe, from, people who are working directly with that, maybe what we can all, share.
Do you mean drawing on funding streams, thinking about what the federal dollars are used for and being more creative at the state level, or trying to actually change the framing that goes, bringing in alignments the federal priorities and the state priorities?
Using the framings that are already in place, the structures
Right.
that are already in place, and maybe linking those together.
Right.
I think a lot of the ideas that the people at the state level and the federal level have have a lot of overlapping themes, but bringing those together and maybe broadening increasing the ability for recipients. We're talking about getting more funding to recipients, increasing, taking the funding streams and getting that out to more people. How can the federal and the state work together? Is that possible? And what ideas do researchers have for that?
Yeah. Well, researchers are real good at studying the reality, not necessarily coming up with the solution ahead of time. I do think it's a matter of aligning, first off, eligibility criteria. If the eligibility criteria are the same, and again, because sometimes small wording changes can keep a family out of getting access to a service when the intent, if one really looked at the intent of the legislation, it would be there. So part of it is around that. Part of it is, I think, from a state perspective, it depends on where you start. If I'm in a state agency, then I'm trying to make the best use first of the state dollars I have, and then seeing where I can augment federal dollars into that. It's not going to solve the problem of the misalignment of mission and objective between the two. And that may be a political solution, not necessarily a research solution. But maybe, Shelley also might have seen some of that.
I'm going to go for, I think Shelley, but I'm going to go to a political solution, which is, where I ended. Is if we're going to really, if we are ready, to lead towards embracing children, in the way we do policy, I think we probably need to do something more radical, like getting a commission on children or somebody at the federal level with enough state representation that really starts looking at this disconnect. I mean, I think those are all great solutions, but I would propose that we really think about how do we not only convene the attention, but really get like a blue ribbon commission to really study it and come up with innovative solutions that then can be, looked at by the different legislators that might want to take a piece or another, sort of like what Shelley was saying. Let's figure out the solution and then let them parcel out what part of it they want.
Yeah, I would echo both of those sentiments. I think on the eligibility one in particular, that we need to start integrating our thinking around eligibility with child developmental needs in mind. So, for example, one of the policy proposals that'll be coming out in this paper that we're writing is that childcare subsidy shouldn't end necessarily when a parent loses their job. You might think about keeping that subsidy going because we know that stability with a caregiver is important to child developmental outcomes. Does that align perfectly with the fact that you only want to give a subsidy to somebody who's working? No, but developmentally, we know that that's important for kids, and we also know that parents need childcare while they're looking for work. So it seems like things like that, thinking about eligibility from a child developmental outcomes perspective is important. And I would agree that higher level leadership at the federal level on this cross-systems work would be another really good idea. There's some other ideas that I think we can all talk about collectively, but I think ultimately, again, as you think about state and local driven solutions and federal solutions, that we need to have a more comprehensive vision about where we see the parts and pieces playing out.
Are there any other questions?
Okay.
Please.
I'm Jenny Weiser, Family and Youth Service Bureau, Department of Health and Human Services. And I have a question in terms of how would you broadly define school readiness and what activities and indicators would get those children to become school ready from the ages of 0 to, say, 15 months? How is that integrated into home-based learning? What would that look like?
I can tell you what we're doing. And I was fortunate that the state of Washington had taken the time to have a group work with Lynn Kagan to develop what we call benchmarks that really have ranges, and they go from birth to 5. They are not just 1 point, but they have ranges. They're still, you know, there could be more work done, but they are a solid piece of work, and that is really what people are using, professionals are using in the state of Washington to begin aligning. I don't pretend to tell you that we have a definition of school readiness. That's a difficult conversation to have, but we have begun, you know, the work has begun, and there's more work. Parents are now asking for, you know, activities that would help them get their children. So it has already raised consciousness not only in providers but in parents. Now, moving towards a definition of school readiness is something we need to do, and that's where we are going to have to show whether we can behave as adults and really, you know, rise to the next level and give our little pet peeves up and really come to the conversation, understanding, you know, and having children at heart and what is it that we want from them.
You know, and I think of school readiness, though, so many people will think narrowly about, oh, they need to know so many numbers, they need to read so many letters, they need to know their colors. But it's also about they need to be able to feel comfortable in a group of other kids. They need to have some social interactions. They need to be inquisitive. They will have been in an environment where when they asked questions, an adult sat down and actually answered it, as opposed to tell them, oh, I'm too busy now, I can't do it. So those are the kinds of environments we want to build in kids, that a real love of learning, a fact that I'm going to this, and this is going to be the most exciting time of my life. That's what I think of school readiness. They can't wait to get out the door because they're going to learn new things, they're going to be with their friends, they're going to be with adults that are going to care for them and teach them. And so when I think of home-based early learning, or what we're doing in a home-based setting, it's not a matter of, you know, reading to kids is great. Language, I'm absolutely not going to disagree with that. But it's also making a child feel secure and safe in being able to be inquisitive. And I don't know if we'll come to that doesn't sound like a formal definition someone would write into a federal piece of legislation. But if you were to ask me as a mom, when I sent my kids to school, what we were looking for, that's exactly what it was.
Let me just refer you to a brand new document that I think makes an incredible contribution. Ross Thompson out of University of California at Chico, and his wife, Janet, just published the Foundations for Early Learning, I think they're called, and they are birth to 5, and very, very grounded in child development. I think that's the kind of work that is really beginning to happen at a much deeper level, that is going to move us towards I hate to say a definition, but a concept, a real common understanding of what school readiness is. And also, you know, a part of this is the school. Is the school ready, or is all the work on the child?
That's right. And, you know, going back to our notion about cross problems, if that was an environment a child was living in, that's an environment where child abuse and neglect is not occurring. So whether we target it as our objective or not, if you think about an environment in which a child is receiving that kind of nurturing and support, they're not being abused and neglected.
Another question?
First of all, I have to say, ladies, great. This has been incredible for me to be here. I'm the project director for a Safe Schools, Healthy Students federal grant, which combines 3 different federal departments: the Department of Justice, the Department of Education, the Department of Human Services. And with that, there's an early childhood component. Also been working with the Federation for Community Schools, which also has an early childhood component. We work, one of our partners is Healthy Families Illinois, and they have space in the schools, providing that advocacy for teen parents and also working with their children, focusing on if the teen parent does well academically, also doing home visiting with the family increases that support and that school readiness for that child. So then my question is, how are we working together with such capacities or such programs as Safe Schools, Healthy Students, or community schools to integrate and work with other partners for early childhood as well into that system?
Yeah, I can talk a little bit about what's going on in Illinois. I think this is one of the key challenges that the Early Learning Council is taking up, is looking sort of at a community level at some of these creative solutions. I think there's both a need to create some new spaces and maybe format and redeploy the existing spaces that we have, as well as thinking about sort of building new facilities. It's a long, challenge, but I think that they're, probably the creative solutions are coming, through some of the local work there.
And if I might add too, I mean, kudos to you and the work that you're doing. Those are 3 big agencies to be pulling together. I think nationally we have a challenge, nationally and locally, and I'll speak as somebody who actually worked at a state level too on these issues, of really bringing the K-12 system into this conversation in a meaningful way. And depending on the community, sometimes you're bringing them in kicking and screaming, and other times they're leading the conversation and bringing the other child advocates to the table, and it varies. But I think ultimately there's a big, as Graciela said, we have to be adults, we have to get over it, and we have to sit down at the table together and figure out how to bridge those gaps. And given that K-12 is one of the universal infrastructure systems that we have in place, good or bad, gaps and warts and all, we have to engage in a conversation about how to weave those pieces together.
Okay. Sam?
Hi, I'm Sam
Hi.
Meisels, president of Erickson Institute. And I'd like to draw your attention to preparation of the people working in the programs you're talking about. I thought your presentations were great, and one of the points they make very clearly is that it's a very heterogeneous set of activities and programs, and hardly a system of any sort that we're talking about here. But when you then look further at who's actually delivering the services, these varied services, you see a tremendous amount of diversity in terms of quality, and with more of it on the bottom end of the scale of quality than on the top end of the scale of quality. One of the things that has happened over time when you look at, for example, the latest reauthorization of Head Start, is that there is an emphasis on encouraging or requiring bachelor's degrees among our teachers, and I think that's a great thing. But just as the programs are not all the same because they bear the same name, BAs are not all the same because they carry with them a bachelor's degree. And so I think the question is, do you see anything happening at state, national, federal, local levels that is going to look not only at the importance of qualifications, but specifically at the quality of performance of the people who are working in these programs? Because I fear that if we don't do that, we're really fooling ourselves.
May I? Should I?
Yes.
Sam, your question hits at the core of what happens to children, because that, regardless of degrees or not, and that's what I was trying to address when I talked about quality improvement and continuous quality improvement. What I have found is that, yes, moving towards a bachelor's or an AA, and we have a lot of work to do on how good those are, but I think we have a tool in a quality improvement system that we still need good coaches and mentors, so we end up in the same issue of supply, but at least we have an opportunity there to link any professional development that happens to what happens to the child and what changes in that child's environment once this professional development, whether it's through coaching or going to take a course at a community college or a university. That's what I was addressing when I was talking about accountability. It's not the perfect solution, but it begins to address what happens to children while we figure out how we do the pre-service and in-service preparation of this workforce. And I will point to that, to the work we did in LAUP, Los Angeles Universal Preschool, LAUP.net, LAUP.net, through the coaching model that is really a change model coming from change theory and management and business. And I think that that's part of the adaptive, innovative change that we need to start doing.
I also think, Sam, there are a variety of things going on in terms of the professionals who may not have a BA and are already out there in terms of cross-training. I know that through some of the training institutes, in particular the Birth to 3 Training Institute, there's a consistent sort of core of trainings on child development, on reflective supervision, management, all that thing that now cut across a variety of these different programs, whether that's home visiting or Parents Too Soon, Parents as Teachers, and now some of the State Board of Education things. So I know that some of the training entities, because as you can imagine, each state agency that had a program program decided to develop its own training entity, and ARM at one point are now beginning to come together and look more collectively at some ways that they can think about what they're doing and really sort of both reduce duplication and ensure that we're getting the skills and the appropriate training to people who are out there and in a variety of settings, because I think the issues that they're dealing with and working with children and families are the same, regardless sometimes of the funding stream and the designs.
And I might add, I think we have to address this. The issues you bring up are so critical that we have to be working concurrently on both a micro level and a macro level. The micro level being, and I think you've been a leader in this area, is really helping integrate real accountability and assessment into quality day-to-day interactions and giving early childhood educators the tools they need in order to do continuous program improvement through the teachers. And I think assessment is key to that. I don't think assessment is testing. I think assessment is what you've been teaching us, what it looks like and the right way to do it. But I think we have to do that, and it's critical and it's key, and it happens at every place in which caregivers are interacting with kids. And just a personal aside, I'm on the board of my own child's preschool. Very parent pay, I'm paying through the nose for this high quality program, and I got a call last night as I was leaving that one of the teachers showed up intoxicated yesterday. So we fool ourselves into thinking that we've got a system that's working anywhere near at the place where it should be for kids and families. And on the macro level, I think the point you bring up in this issue of the schools of education is key. If we had run any other parts of our schools, the way the schools of education have run, in the variability of the quality of program, we just wouldn't accept it in most other industries. We have got to have a serious conversation about what an early childhood educator needs when they are educated. It's time to engage the higher ed program, put the money in where it needs to be, but we know now, we have research, we understand what this needs to look like and what educators need to know in order to do good quality early childhood development, and it's time to implement it, and we're behind the curve on that.
Okay, I think we need to wrap up, but we could sneak in one last question.
Thank you. My name is Tomasa Cadiz. Excuse me. And I'm with the Family, Youth, and Family Services Bureau with the Administration for Children and Families. My question is what are the chances of policies being put in place for parents to be able to stay at home, work from home, to make it possible so they can receive their children when they come home from school or when they come home from early Head Start or whatever the program they're in? I think it's absolutely crucial for them to have a stability and security they need to learn when they do go to school.
If I can jump in, because this is one of my newfound passions, I think, is this issue of work and family, so thanks for bringing it up. I mean, quite frankly, we have a country and a work environment that's just hostile to parenting. And I think part of the way I've come to this from the early childhood field is really for those developmental concerns that you bring up. And I think trying to figure out ways to address the workplace and how employers can play a role in this. And there's some interesting work going on by a group at Georgetown University called the Workplace Flexibility 2010 Initiative, which is trying to actually build in more workplace flexibility so that parents can be both good parents and good workers. And trying to bring a dialogue to this discussion. I can tell you, I thought early childhood was hard to solve. You start getting into labor policy with business on one side and unions on the other, and I think, boy, we've got a long way to go. But I think there's an effort to try to bring that to the table. In an era of welfare reform and trying to now really address the needs of working families, which most children are living in these days, it's a critical piece to bring to our conversation. At some point, if you're feeling like I am, the table feels so big that you feel like perhaps you'd like to just hide underneath it. But I really do, again, think that it's a piece of the component and the conversation that we have to get moving. And I do think paid parental leave is one of those areas that's critically important. If you look at other industrialized nations, we are so far behind on the amount of time we give people and parents to bond with their children at this critical developmental moment for both parents and for kids. And that's a plug I'd put in for that particular policy area, and one that we should all be able to rally around.
Okay. Thank you, Shelley. Now we'll hear from Matt Stegner.
Thank you. I just want to say a couple of words to close this year's Thursday's Child season. First, with thanks to our panel, first of all, for a very lively discussion. Secondly, to our live audience and those listening on the web, we are doing this, we hope, because this is a valuable resource for you, and we would love to hear from you about how to make it more valuable. Thursday's Child is going to resume here in October in Chicago, and we'll have a season hitting on, we hope, the key topics in children's policy in the coming year. We'll move to DC in November, and when you can't be live in either place, we hope you will join us on the web. But thank you for joining us today. Thanks again to the panel, and good luck with the good work you all do. Thank you.
I need to connect up with that. I have a sense of